G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. And dangerous ideas are what the intellectual dark web was originally all about. This gaggle of folks, of independent media personalities, of journalists, of academics who sort of coalesced, about 10 years ago around an idea of talking about taboo subjects in a fearless way. That grouping may have collapsed into ashes and sometimes acrimony, but the phenomenon warrants some kind of examination, which is what today's guest has done in a new book. He's an academic himself, Dr. Jamie Roberts. He's a lecturer in the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney, a position which is increasingly fraught as he gets censured and sanctioned for trying to wrestle through some of the same sorts of hot-button culture war issues that the IDW was known for. His book is called The Way of the Intellectual Dark Web, What Joe Rogan and His Associates Can Teach Us About Political Dialogue. He's a political philosopher himself, and if you're looking forward to reading the book, you can't, because it's currently embroiled in a controversy about some of the ideas that it contains. There's been something of a backlash at the publisher, who is not selling the book at the moment and is about to haul him in front of some kind of presumably kangaroo court to try to answer for the ideas that he is exploring, for having the temerity, the audacity to kick the hornet's nest. I hope you enjoy this conversation with the unique academic, Dr. Jamie Roberts. You went for a run?
Yeah, I was like, well, I do caffeine. I'm like, I'll have a cup of green tea and then just like do 10Ks, psych up the natural way.
That's so annoyingly healthy. Right? That's disgustingly,
yeah, it's disgusting, yeah.
Like I feel morally inferior now that I'm sucking on my caffeine and you've just been for a 10K.
Yeah.
Did you say?
Yeah, I could talk about running for 2 hours, but
we
won't, but yeah.
Wow. Running all your life?
No, since my mid-30s. Since my mid-30s, when I was like, you do nothing in your 20s and you get fat, and then like started running, and it's been so great.
Do you listen to anything
when I run?
Mm-hmm.
No, totally zen. I try to run as like free as possible, like just shorts, shoes, just.
That's good. I feel like I get bored.
Yeah, but if you want to like.
That's because my mind is chattering too much.
No, like I know the feeling, and I'm like that when I drive. But there's like a rule with running. You know what I mean? It's like,
well, if you're going to drink your fucking green tea and go for a run, you have to be all holistic about it. And not want your mind to be.
But at the same time, it's actually nice because you meet people, or if you're in the bush, animals, smells. It's kind of like
yeah. You can still see the animals and smell the smells and listen to a podcast.
Oh, okay.
I don't know what podcasts you're consuming, but if they're like a full sensory VR headset with smell-o-vision as well, then you're ahead of the game. So this book is fascinating. The Way of the Intellectual Dark Web, What Joe Rogan and His Associates Can Teach Us About Political Dialogue.
That's a hell of a sub.
I love a long subtitle.
I had to fight for it.
Did you? What were they pushing back on?
You know what? I can't remember what they suggested, but it was something horrifically dull. But I'm like,
right.
I have to. I wanted to jam as many names into the subtitle as I could.
right.
I was trying to get Jordan Peterson,
Joe Rogan, Sam Harris,
and the other. But yeah, I thought I've got to at least get Joe Rogan in there. So.
Yeah, that's good. I think if I write a book, it'll just be all subtitle. Like there'll be a title, and then the subtitle will be 160 pages, and then the book will just be a coda. An epilogue. You call the intellectual dark web a massive but decentralized popular intellectual movement. What is it for people who aren't quite as online as we are?
Okay, yeah. So the intellectual dark web was a funny term cooked up by Eric Weinstein to describe a phenomenon, I guess, that he'd observed in the previous, this was, I guess, around 2018, maybe from 2015, 16, 17 onwards, that there was a bunch of people who were talking about ideas that were somewhat taboo within universities, the mainstream media, and it was taking place online. It was an intellectual movement because it was very much based in psychology, philosophy, reasoning, enlightenment values, that kind of thing.
What were they saying that was taboo that mainstream outlets weren't?
So it's a lot of the familiar topics. the trans topic is always the most taboo, but talking about, there's an edge at the moment which is anti-male, which, I mean, I can talk forever about this stuff, which in some ways is fair enough because, God knows men do terrible things, but it's
not all men.
Not all men. Yeah. I know.
I mean, it's become a punchline that you can even say that, but it is true.
Yeah. I mean, it's about trying to understand the nature of populations and,
So, I mean, the one thing you do in the book is like break down each of the individual sort of taboos that were of interest to this group of
trans
people.
Stuff, so masculinity,
biological sex, race and police violence,
the
masculinity,
West,
the West,
hating
the
the
West is under attack.
Which is true. I mean, it's been like that since I started uni in the late 90s and, it's been going on before then. And again, it's like everything. It's like, there's a reasonable critique to be made, but as with everything, it's like it's almost obvious. It's painfully obvious. Like you weigh things. What are the good things? What are the bad things? But the vogue at the moment is to not weigh, but to just denounce. And so, so the intellectual dark web's more like, well, pros and cons. A lot of it's like painfully obvious, but it just doesn't. It's taboo.
Has the movement spiraled off the rails though?
That's a great question. I mean, Eric Weinstein, actually, you mentioned this even on Chris Williamson. Did you? I think you did anyway. Audience capture. So, he was conscious of that from the get-go. The idea that once you become successful, there's if you're a little bit more extreme and a little bit more one-sided and, and if you lose your nuance and if you lose your caution, you are then heavily rewarded because people like blood. They like you to be more extreme. And so you can spiral. So I mean, basically every figure in the IDW, of which there's, 8 or 9 at the core, another 10 or 15, and then, 30, 40. I mean, you're in it.
I've never been more flattered not to be mentioned in a book.
You know what? I felt kind of bad because I was like, if I was redoing the book now, I'd put you in there.
Well, I'm glad that I wasn't. I'm glad you were right. I mean, because
maybe you've come to it a bit later, though.
Yes, that's true. I mean, I don't think it's a flattering. I don't think the term is used in a positive way.
Really?
I mean, I feel like ever since Sam Harris last year said, if there ever was such a thing as an IDW, I hereby formally hand in my card.
That's interesting.
I think that was the end. I think it's now regarded as something that ended up being a pathway for crackpots to end up in crack pottery. I mean, the Brett Weinstein, like nobody thinks that today Brett Weinstein and even Jordan Peterson and even Joe Rogan are more temperate-minded and reasonable people than they were when the IDW started.
Okay, that's interesting.
6 years ago.
So I was going to say, that for all of the figures, I've kind of got my own little tally in my head of who I think's gone off the rails more or less. So it's interesting, So you think Joe Rogan's got worse? Brett Weinstein's
I wouldn't say worse because, but more.
Well, further to the right.
Yeah, maybe more narrow, more captured in particular ideas that they would once have been open-minded to. I'm thinking specifically about vaccines and the pandemic, right?
Yeah. See, I didn't actually even touch the pandemic in the book because I just thought, look, that's past the IDW heyday, but at the same time, it's sort of a major.
I mean, I still love Joe, and I have huge affection for him as a person and huge gratitude to him. And I think on the whole, on balance, what he does is a good thing. And yet, again, coming back to the question of sort of temperance, moderation, curiosity, open-mindedness, I think there's less of that now than there was 6 years ago, let alone 10.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. I mean, God, the pandemic's such an unbelievably difficult topic to talk about. I mean, I'm constantly running it through in my mind and trying to think, what do I know? What do I don't know? What do I know about the vaccines? What do I know about the lockdowns? And I'm no expert, but we all have to ask these questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think, did Joe go too far with having some of his guests on and with not, maybe pushing some of them hard enough? Yeah.
I mean, there's clearly a counterpoint to that, which is that at least there is a reckoning, I think, on most of the moderate people on the right that there was an argument to be had around what we were doing and what they were believing. Whereas I don't think there's much soul searching in a place like Australia about whether or not the lockdowns went too far. I think everyone in Australia just generally thinks, well, it worked and we saved lots of lives. So, why critique the edges?
I mean, I think Eric Weinstein's come through it all pretty well.
Yeah. I mean, Eric and Sam, I would say.
Eric, I think, manages to, not lose his step, is my sense. He does pretty damn well. And it
can't be easy for him, given his family.
No, but I mean, I agree with the names that you mentioned. Those are people I would think, Joe, Brett, Jordan have maybe slid a bit more. Eric's held on. Sam. So they got Sam with the whole what is it? Trump derangement syndrome thing.
Yeah, I mean,
on trigonometry.
It's always seemed like a cheap shot.
I thought so too.
Yeah,
he still has my respect.
Yeah. I mean, when you talk a lot, people can take you out of context.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it?
In the least charitable possible way.
That's the problem. I mean, once you've got thousands upon thousands of hours or hundreds of hours, isn't it, behind you, you're always going to say something stupid. It's like that because, I lecture at uni and so, and I do it on my feet. I mean, what am I trying to say? Like I don't read. And so something's always going to slip out.
Has it?
Has it? That's interesting. No, I think if I have a problem, it's not getting the tone right every now and then. That's really hard because when you're sort of up against it and you're talking about the taboo things, how do you talk about the taboo things in like a university environment? You have to, if you're too nervous, they smell blood in the water and they come for you. So I've had that kind of experience, especially back in like Zoom heyday of COVID teaching, and that was still sporting. I mean, it's okay when they come for you because at least if they're having a discussion, you're like, I remember one lecture broke down at about the hour mark, and then the whole second hour was just douche.
What was it about? Do you remember?
I was about the intellectual dark web. So I try to talk about this stuff in one of my units. Not just the intellectual dark web, but free speech, cancel culture. Well, that's the intellectual dark web, but yeah, free speech.
And so, what was the content of the disagreement in the?
What am I trying to? Yeah, I'm trying to remember. This was a couple of years back. No, I was just raising issues like I already mentioned, like saying, at university, if you say, I hate the West, it's like high distinction.
Colonialism, post-colonialism, decolonizing.
Decolonize, high distinction. And so, my approach is not even to say, to have a definitive position. But as I said before, it's just like, let's weigh these things. Let's not just get a free pass by saying, the politically expedient thing. But then even saying that marks you as on the other side.
Right, because you're implying that there is a politically expedient thing, or that there is a bias I wouldn't even say institution.
Oh yeah, maybe I wouldn't. Maybe I would say politically expedient. Actually.
Well, you said it.
Yeah, no, I did just say it. I know
we don't have to hypothesize here about whether you would say it, Jamie. We literally just.
Would I say? Did I say it?
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. I mean, so are you finding that there's a bias in academia towards one set of ideas versus another set of ideas? I mean, you're supposed to, in an ideal world in academia, they would just reward the clarity of thought regardless of where the thought led the person. You think so, wouldn't you?
Honestly, I think that what so many people say around the world about academia is true. I think it's largely broken, not completely broken. There are so many, I mean, I can tell you various anecdotes and whatnot. I mean, there are so many just diverse flaws in it, which prevent just open, free discussion based on reasoning and evidence, all the stuff
like
we've heard for so many years.
What are some of the anecdotes?
One of the, this first one that comes to mind, one of the things that pisses me off, I mean, so many things piss me off, so many. But one of the things that pisses me off is the use of theory. Now, what happens is people will go and study something, and that's fine, and they'll maybe do some interviews or read about it, and that's all good and well because that's your data. And then you'd in the ideal world you'd have a question, what would say, who is this group? What do they want? Are they good or bad? What should be done about them? Usual, typical, because I'm in, politics, usual, typical questions. But what happens at uni is you have a thing called a theoretical framework. Even just saying it triggers me so much. I'm so triggered right now.
You snowflake.
It's interesting. I think about that. I think I am a bit of a snowflake, but maybe we can get to that later.
Yeah.
So I don't disown that. I don't disown that. But yeah, so with a theoretical framework, what you do is you essentially pick the broad way you're going to interpret your data or whatever beforehand, and you lay it out at the start. My theoretical framework is such and such, and people invariably pick something like constructivism, which basically means everything is a social construction and everything's about power or whatever. And so essentially you select how you will interpret your material before you interpret your material. It's obviously wrong, like you don't. It's just legitimized confirmation bias, but because it's wrapped up in, theory, it sounds all kind of intelligent and uni-like. When you read, say, a good article in Foreign Policy or Foreign Affairs, they don't do any of that. They'll just like analyze a political phenomenon and talk about it cogently, whatever. But yeah, at uni, you do that, but then you wrap it all up in this kind of theoretical framework.
So it's almost like you're starting with a bias.
Exactly.
An explicit bias.
Exactly. And it's totally legit. And
why is it legit?
Because the system's broken. It's legit because
Oh, you mean it's legit within the system?
Yeah.
But you wouldn't regard it as
being
legit?
It's totally broken.
Right.
But yeah, it comes down. Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose. Helen Pluckrose wasn't on Rogan, but when those guys were on Rogan several years back, they talked about all of this. So it's been going on forever, really, for decades. But yeah, it's all. Peterson's always postmodernism. Postmodern Marxists. And look, he's not that wrong. Postmodernism basically, everyone knows, but yeah, it says that there is no truth. There's only power, and power determines what we understand to be meant as truth. And so that's a great weapon for attacking the powerful enemy. So rather than attacking them with arguments or reason or whatever, you just give them the atomic bomb of postmodernism and say, there is no truth, there is only power. And so you get rid of them. And, it's not the way to do it, but it is a way. And often it's right, because often the powerful do use their power to manipulate truth. So there's a very large grain of salt to it. But then what happens is then the academics are like, actually, this is kind of an interesting point. There is no truth, there's only power. And you throw in intersectionality, or what Nietzsche would call slave morality, where the less power you have, everyone knows this, the oppression Olympics, whatever, the less power you have, the more right you are. So you mix in postmodern relativism and a lack of power, and then basically you can say whatever you want. And so...
As long as you're punching up, as long as you're bringing down the powerful, as long as you're exposing power structures that may not be apparent.
Yeah. And so even as I'm starting to talk, I feel my brain starting to go to jelly. But then all of this stuff is built on paradoxes and things which make no sense, but which are never really explicitly articulated. But it all just sort of simmers beneath the surface.
What kind of paradoxes?
It's a lot easier when you can actually have some text in front of you and you go, okay, look, they say this, they say that.
Well,
whatever.
let me give you an example that I remember from university in the early 2000s when I was doing a class about Asia-Pacific politics, and the tutor was, someone who she really thought it was fabulous just to bring down the straight white male population of the class as much as possible.
Yeah, that hasn't changed.
And so we were talking about Tiananmen Square, and she was saying that, consider that democracy is an idea that the West imposes as being a fact or a truth about the way that human beings want to live, like liberalism and democracy. But in actual fact,
big discussion there.
Those are culturally contingent ideas, right? That you only agree with because you were born in this society, and if you were born in China, you would have very different ideas about them. All of that's true, but I being the
somewhat true,
I being the smart ass
somewhat true
that I was, said, I'm sure that would have come as some great consolation to the people who were being mown down by tanks in Tiananmen Square. But nonetheless, their bodies were still smeared across the square, and they probably didn't like that very much. I didn't get a good grade in that in that class.
Yeah.
But like, it struck me that was probably a particular moment in time. 20th century French philosophy was still influential in the 90s and the 2000s.
Changed. It hasn't
Really?
gone away. Nothing has shifted. It's I first noticed this early 2000s. I think I was a convert in 99 when I was an undergrad. I think they kind of got to me. But then by the time I started thinking for myself a little bit more in my early mid-20s, I started asking questions and, learned that you weren't meant to. And, this stuff hasn't changed, this kind of relativistic soup that the university swims in. That's what I was saying. Theoretical frameworks are a version of that because there isn't exactly truth. Well, you can start with your conclusion by wrapping everything in your theoretical framework. And when you poke at it, it makes no sense at all. But you're allowed to do it because there's like a background of relativism that sort of
Would there be a
encompasses
non-relativistic theoretical framework that you could come in with and write your thesis saying, all right, I'm starting from this alternative position?
Okay, it's really interesting that you asked that. So I'm in politics, but you can sort of do this anywhere. They're all sort of similar. People would say, constructivism is like the highly relativistic one. If you're in politics or international relations, people would say realism, which is, the more pessimistic account that states are destined to have conflict because there isn't an overarching power. Or liberalism, which you mentioned, which assumes human nature like classical realism, but it's more optimistic. It thinks, by trading, by sharing knowledge, development, the world will become more peaceful. So these are different, you might call theoretical frameworks. And I suppose you could take one of those and start with that. But I don't like that either. It's the same problem. If you just begin by assuming realism's correct and then you interpret everything in that light, it's the same flaw. So
would supporters of a theoretical framework model say, you need to do that because you need to make explicit the framework that you're coming in with, because there is no such thing as coming to anything neutrally. Like, you're not going to be a tabula rasa. You're not coming from nowhere. There's no view. There's no objective place to stand on the moon where you can look back at the world and depict it impartially. Is that the
that's the
idea?
That's the kind of argument that would be made, and that's, I suppose, why postmodernism and the like endure.
What's wrong with that argument?
What's wrong with that argument, I suppose, is that, getting to the truth is difficult. And yes, we do bring biases with us, but the answer to that is not to then just go the whole hog and import an entire worldview. What you would ought to do in the long scientific tradition is, recognize that we all, have biases, and this is so much harder in the social sciences, but still we must do it to the best of our ability. Consider, present as many possible reasonable interpretations of what we're looking at, explore each one in turn, weigh them up judiciously, and then come to a conclusion. Now, a realist position or a liberal position or a constructivist position, they are all just one interpretation. Each one is an interpretation amongst many. So what you ought to do is say, well, a constructivist would say this. How well would that be supported? A liberal might say this. A realist might say this. And there might be a range of other interpretations as well. Good scholarship for me would be just considering the range of perspectives to the best of our ability, weighing them up, and then trying to derive a conclusion. You're still going in with the question, what's going on? Should it be happening? How can we fix things? These are the basic questions. And so, you bring in as many perspectives as you can. That's the approach that I'd encourage. But it's just, and that's, that's the best we can do.
It strikes me that there's an analogy here to journalism as well, to my profession, where there's an older guard of people who acknowledge that there is bias but strive to eliminate bias as much as possible and to provide as many as rigorous a fidelity to the truth as possible. And then there's a young guard of people who are who are more activist, who believe that the fact that bias exists means you might as well lean into it and tell your own story and your own truth from your own perspective.
Yeah, and there's a place for that. Like I'm not opposed to people sort of passionately telling their own truth from their own perspective, but when it becomes censorious, then you're in trouble. You know, when you start getting punished for talking about things, then it becomes bad. But look, I mean, this is the staggering challenge of the Enlightenment tradition. I mean, it's hard enough in the sciences. What does Feynman says? I always quote this to the students. The first rule is don't fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. That's good. But he was talking about that in the physics realm. The social sciences and the arts are so much harder, or journalism, same sort of thing. But yeah, you still try. So as you say, the old guard, I don't see what other option we have, really. I don't see what other option we have.
One instance of that censoriousness when people are just trying to explore the truth is, you mentioned in the book, which is the James Damore episode at Google, where Google invited employees to. Well, do you want to tell the story or remind people of it? Most people probably heard about it at the time.
Yeah. So the James Damore story is, people's like, here's another martyr for the right wing, and it is a bit like that. But at the same time, it's a reasonable point. What did they have? I don't know, diversity training or something like that in Google, and then they asked for feedback. So Damore, I don't know, a bit on the spectrum or whatever they say, and he's like, all right, okay. He's obviously, I could see you could tell he'd been getting into the intellectual dark web type stuff, and so he, done a whole lot of research into, sex, characteristics, intelligence, and how all of these things play out in complex ways. And he put together quite a thoughtful memo, which was quite balanced. And he said, look, I don't believe in stereotypes, and I really want to solve this problem. But
the problem being the predominance of men
I didn't explain that well.
Like Google engineering positions and stuff.
Too many men in aspects of tech. And, so the question would be, what is the cause of that? Sorry. Is it sexism or is it preference? And it's difficult to get to the bottom of it. There's probably an aspect of sexism. Although, when I look at the spread of the sexes across professions, it seems like women are doing very well in law now. Why is it that tech's sexist but law isn't? And, these are all difficult questions to answer. And
they're overrepresented in medicine. They're overrepresented.
Yeah, and so women are overrepresented in a lot of areas. Men are overrepresented as forklift drivers and truck drivers. It could be sexism, or it could be preference, which relates to different types of intelligence. And, the idea that the intellectual dark web often talk about, which is a good one, is that when you have populations, men and women, and you have like a certain type of intelligence, say spatial intelligence, even though the two populations are actually very similar, there's a slight difference in meaning that men, from what I've read, have a slightly higher spatial intelligence. But what that means is there's a big overrepresentation of men right out at the tail. And so when you're going to choose a job, generally you're going to choose something which is, you're really strong at. So that would be the kind of argument, I guess, that I can't remember all the details, but that Damore would be making, that there are reasons why men are overrepresented. And
because the tail of the bell curve, the edge of the bell curve,
has more men in it.
Yeah, which is where you would be picking the world's greatest
engineers
from.
Yeah. It just happens to have more men in it.
Right. And if you were talking about the mediation of family disputes or something like that, then you have more women in that.
Yeah, perhaps because women are more linguistically intelligent. These are all very, very small differences at the population level, but at the tails.
Isn't it also true that the tails are longer in men?
I don't know.
I've heard Peterson talk about this and say that there are more male CEOs,
Actually,
but there are also more men in jail.
Right. I have looked into this.
There are more male homeless drug addicts than women, as well as.
I think it depends. It depends on what you're measuring. Sorry. Yeah, it depends on what you're measuring. But when I was looking into intelligence, women tend to be a bit more bunched. So you get more men who do well and more men who do worse. I'm not an expert on this. I've just read a few studies, and it seems to be like this. And it might be the case with a range of other characteristics as well.
And the upshot is, if we didn't mention it, that James Damore got fired for writing the memo at Google after Google had invited people
him to do it.
To chime in, but simply hinting at or arguing for the existence of a difference in preferences. It was enough to have him shown the door.
Yeah, because it's once you I suppose it's the paradigm people want, which again the intellectual dark web talk a lot about, is equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity, which is a classic tension. I'm a huge fan of pushing for equality of opportunity.
Is it a phony dichotomy? I've never quite liked it. It sees...
This sounds interesting.
Well, it seems lazy to me, because it seems like no one wants only either. I don't think. I mean, true equality of opportunity would be so dramatically different from the world we live in that it would entail a kind of a bit of equality of outcome, in the sense that, like, nobody who I know is arguing for full equality of outcome. Nobody who I know thinks that everybody should make exactly the same amount of money regardless of what they do.
Yeah, I know, but yet the thing is, but this is the way a lot of this stuff works, is that when you push people, it's always like, it's the Mott and Bailey fallacy, which is also in the book that Eric Weinstein talked about.
That distinction.
No, but see, this is very important, which is why I'm such a fan of the IDW, because they cover a lot of these maneuvers. So what happens is when you're with your buddies, you say all kinds of crazy extreme stuff, which is very, very hard to support. But then when you're pushed in a more moderate environment, you pull back and make a more moderate defensible claim. And so, as you say, no one would really support equality of outcome. I'm like, yeah, they wouldn't. And yet at the same time, when I look at university policies that are creeping in and, the rhetoric that people use sometimes, it does very much draw on equality of outcome. And then you push people and they say, oh, no. Oh, no. I didn't mean that at all. No.
Right. I mean, there could be a specific...
So it's like a shifting that people do in different environments.
There could be a specific equality of outcome that you might be looking for, such as the undergraduate class should racially represent the racial makeup of the country, right? You could make that as I do know people who would argue for that. That would be an equality of outcome. I just mean, as a general principle of morality, I don't think you can universalize equality of outcome. Yeah, I don't know. I need to think through more clearly what I object to about that. But
I like your point, though. I mean, of course, all of these things are broad brushstrokes, and
like
you've got to look at individual statements, and you have to look at individual cases, and look what people said, and look what people are trying to achieve, and then you can break it down and go, oh, I see why there's a problem here.
Just take equality of opportunity. Let's just say that all you want is equality of opportunity. The world you would have to create for a person living with a horrendously debilitating physical condition, physical disability, who is a trans woman of color at the same time and has no arms or legs, for that person to have the same equality of opportunity as a beautiful, handsome, 6'2", white male is going to be so many resources that it would be almost indistinguishable from equality of outcome.
That's a deep point. I like it. Yeah.
Like, what would the equality of opportunity even mean if you weren't measuring it by the yardstick of the outcome? You know what I mean? You'd have to look at the outcomes and sort of see whether the outcomes are reasonably fair. And then what is fair?
Reasonably fair.
Like, is it fair for the person who's born with an IQ of 150 to do better than the person who's born with an IQ of 70? Like, is that equality of opportunity? There's no opportunity in being born with an IQ of 70.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, so there's much complexity and subtlety that we need to work through.
You need to answer all these questions for me, Jamie, immediately.
No, I love it though. Keep them coming. So, but So obviously, it's not like this broad policy that you put in. It's a tendency,
right? It's where do your sympathies lie?
Yeah, it's a tendency, and as I say, when you look at particular problems, sometimes you can say, oh yeah, this is a problem because, like back to the Damore point, if there is not equality of outcome, therefore egregious discrimination,
Right.
rather than some other cause, which we could call equality of opportunity or something else entirely. It could just, be preferences or whatever. So that's a case of putting too much weight on equality of outcome, and not just wanting it, but assuming that inequality of outcome has specific causes, namely egregious discrimination.
Right.
So,
and
so putting in that context, it makes a bit more sense.
Yes, and this has become an article of faith in progressive social justice circles, that the evidence of a disparity means that there's some kind of systemic discrimination that's going on.
Yeah. So Pinker says this. A lot of people say this. Yeah. I've heard Coleman Hughes say it recently. These are all IDW talking points. Yeah. Inequality of outcome is not proof of discrimination.
Right.
Sometimes it is.
Yeah.
Sometimes it isn't. You got to look at it closely.
Right.
You got to weigh it up.
The underrepresentation of Jews in professional basketball is not evidence of discrimination, anti-Semitism in basketball.
I mean, there's discrimination in a sense. They're not good enough,
right.
whatever.
Yes,
but I mean, it's not. When I say, I think what did I say before? Egregious discrimination. It's not like the kind of discrimination where you'd say, "Oh, that's not right."
Not discriminatory, but it may be discriminating in some way.
Yeah.
The Mott and Bailey thing, there's a passage in the book where I think you give a good example you don't call it a Mott and Bailey, but it is the same move, where Jordan Peterson is doing that famous interview.
The Kathy Newman.
With, is it? No.
Oh,
is it Kathy
sorry.
Newman, is it?
I don't know. I interrupted.
Oh, yes, it is. and he says there's no disparity in income between men and women when you adjust for all the variables that you would want to adjust for. She says, but there still is. Like, even when you adjust for everything, there's 9%.
I don't think she was saying even when you adjust for everything. I think she was just saying it's a fact.
Oh, okay. He then says, but it's not obvious to me that you can attribute that disparity to discrimination.
Yeah.
That's a good example of a Mott and Bailey switch, where he starts by saying there's no disparity. Then he gets pushed on it, and he retreats to the more defensible position of there may be a disparity, but it's not for the reasons that you think it is.
Yeah. I think at that point he had a flourish which was overly strong. And so, but I mean, look, in a way, that's also the way discussion works, and it's not a bad thing. I mean, look, I start with a bit of a what was it? What is it? What's the one? The strong statement, the Mott. Yeah, where I'm like, equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome, and then you push me a bit, and then I walk it back a little bit. I mean, that is also in the nature of discussion. We often start with an overly strong point to bring clarity to the discussion,
right?
And then when you're pushed in good faith, you then walk it back a little bit and bring nuance to it. So I feel like that's something that happens.
You'll give him a pass on it.
Yeah. Maybe. I have to go back and look at the transcript again, which I won't.
How did the issue of race and police violence and the protests in 2020, what did that do to this movement of heterodox intellectuals online?
I don't think it did anything bad. I think it was just a classic opportunity for people to try to think clearly about all of this. I had in the book Sam Harris, what is it, Stepping Back from the Edge, which was interesting too. I think I heard on some of the podcasts recently some people praising it. So I think it was.
This was an episode of his podcast that he did when everything was going up.
Yeah, when everything was going to hell. And
and you also talk about John McWhorter and Glenn Lowry, who were useful voices of sanity.
Yeah. I feel like they're part of the IDW as well. But no, I think it's just. God, Black Lives Matter is so. I try to talk about it with my students a bit, and it's so damn risky. It's like almost impossible. But
why is that?
It's just yet another taboo subject. God, white person raising questions about race. I feel like I have to, because across all of this is the concern that on the one hand. Not on the one hand, from my point of view, we ought to be trying to pursue truth. We ought to be trying to understand reality to the best of our ability. And against that, there is always a sort of cultishness that can spring up on the left or the right, which then prevents you from talking about certain things. And I mean, that's the eternal battle, sort of truth versus power or cultishness. And so I feel like, at university, this is exactly what we should be talking about in politics. These are the issues of the day. And yet there's a huge, taboo against trying to understand the truth of, God, we're talking about America, not even talking about Australia, but, the truth of police violence in America, how many black people are killed, how many white people are killed, what's the nature of the, how many interactions are there with police, what's the crime level within the black community, what's the crime level within the white community. And these are all the kind of questions you have to ask, before you can kind of understand whether the police are excessively violent towards black people or not. And I can't sit here and tell you all the answers because I don't have them off the top of my head. But these are the, some of the questions that IDW types were talking about. And then the other immense taboo is, well, let's say black communities are doing worse in various measures. What's the cause? And the popular response is, like white racism in one form or another, whereas like McWhorter and Lowry would say, yeah, sure, but there are also cultural problems. And this is really, really hard to say because I'm pretty confident those cultural problems exist because of the horrific past. And so this is a really difficult position that we end up in around the world when you have a particular group that has been persecuted and then you have generations of trauma or whatever leading to them, cultural problems later on. So, you've got a very deep problem within a culture, but so it's not like really a good idea to say, well, it's just racism now, which is the problem. And yet it's totally unpalatable to say, well, the culture has a problem because it was caused by earlier racism. It's that kind of subtle thinking, which is just, it's very difficult to, even now, like but like it's that kind of nuanced thinking which needs to occur. If we're going to solve
nothing
problems.
that you've said sounds that controversial to me.
It's controversial enough that if I talk about this stuff at uni, look, it depends on the class, depends on, sometimes you have
where it gets controversial and where I think it gets dangerous and worrying is when it goes a step further and you get into the territory of, well, what are the IQ differences between various populations?
Oh my
and
God,
maybe
that
there
discussion.
are, this is an issue that has become more interesting to some people on the right than I would necessarily want it to
Maybe a
be.
little too interesting.
A little too interesting. A lot of people focusing on whether or not there are IQ differences between whites and blacks and Asians and whatever.
But we're also talking at the population level, which means if there is an IQ difference between races, we're talking about a small difference between means. It doesn't, obviously it doesn't mean that
tell you anything about
everyone's...
the individual.
It doesn't tell you anything about the
individual.
individual.
That always also seems like a cop-out to me when people say that because, of course, we're talking about the population level. It's still a devastating thing to say about a population if it's true that they're all more stupid than... not all, comparatively, like for like, more stupid. That would be...
Yeah, it's savage.
Savage. And just, in the same way that if you say that men are more violent than women, we all understand that you're not saying that every single man is
It's
violent.
easy to say that though, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I would say that,
Yeah, that's right.
Men can be real...
Yeah, that's right. So men are more violent than women, but we don't always feel a need to say, well, of course, we're talking about a population level. You can't infer the violence of an individual on the basis of the population. You can a bit because you can take a Bayesian prior and say, all right, right? You can sort of, whatever you're coming in with, your assumptions about probability, you can say, well, I know that men on average are more violent than women. Therefore, when I meet a stranger who's a male,
you're right to be cautious.
I'm more right to be cautious.
It's funny though, you can say that about men, and that's fine, and I'm fine with that. But yeah, you wade into other population statements,
right? If you said it about black people,
and it becomes,
or even about violence, or even if you or criminality, for example, if you said
I can feel it. Like I can feel, we have a very, very, very keen sense of taboos. You can feel that discussion's
absolutely
fine.
Yeah,
that one's taboo. But yeah, what have I heard people say about the intelligence one? Some discussions are best left alone, but then on the other hand, we should be pursuing truth. It's a savage problem.
Where do you land on that?
The intelligence question is so difficult. I don't know. ultimately we should pursue truth, but God, things get used badly.
If there was a reasonable solution, like if I thought that the truth was being pursued because on the other side of the hill there's this land of milk and honey and pleasure and plenty where we could solve the problem if only we knew the fact.
It'd help.
Yeah, if it would help, then maybe I'd be more sympathetic to it. But in the absence of knowing exactly what, let's suppose that it were true that there was a 5-point IQ difference on average between blacks and whites. It's not clear to me what that would assist with, except for providing some kind of moral rationale for white people to feel smug and superior in some way.
And yet there has been a long study of intelligence across men and women, and that's a little less. I mean, that's still vexed, but it's not as vexed.
And women are smarter? No, I'm not kidding.
From what I can gather, general intelligence, when you mash it all together, is close to indistinguishable. But on specific intelligences, women do a little better maybe on linguistic stuff. Men do a little better spatially. And so, then the stereotypes flow. Men hunt, women sit round campfire, gossip, you know.
Right.
With stereotype voice,
Caveman.
Yeah, caveman voice. Yeah, but yeah, we seem to have less. That's still less of a problem. But then maybe it's because but then at the same time, what you mentioned before, men being more spread and women being more bunch, which I don't know, seems to be the case from what I've seen. That's a little concerning because it means that there's a reason why men keep getting Nobel Prizes, and if that's the case, then it's not necessarily. It's not going to be an equality of outcome that's going to be easy to fix. So that's a case where, intelligence measures make us feel pretty uncomfortable.
Yeah, maybe. But I mean, then you can also go back to a pipeline problem and say, well, of course, men win the majority of the Nobel Prizes because they are raised, or they were historically at least, raised in societies where boys could grow up and go to university.
Inequality of opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's very difficult to untangle all of that. But the point is, if that intelligence reading is correct, then that will provide part of the explanation. Yes, right. But I know, back on the race thing, look, God, it's so much worse. Even as you say, when we talk about it. I mean, but the thing is with men and women, that it does make sense to think about it, because if you're trying to understand, back to Damore, why are there more men in certain professions? Why are there more, men in the trades? It could be because they're sexist, or it could be because certain men tend to be inclined towards working with their hands more.
Yeah, it is funny
so that's the thing. If we want to then say we need 50%, this is the old joke, if we need 50% female bricklayers, we need that, equality of outcome, and people are just like, I don't know.
Yeah, do you need 50% of offshore oil rig?
Yeah, I know, and
workers being women.
Yeah, and so the thing is that in those cases, maybe understanding the way different intelligence attributes then feed into preferences, then make us chill out a little about pushing for equality of outcome. Maybe I'm cautious because of course there are social issues, but in that case it makes sense. But yeah, you move into the race realm and it's just grotesque. I don't want to touch it. I don't want to talk about it.
It's still an article of faith among many people that women earn 70 cents on the dollar. There's even a day of the year in like March or April, right, where they say this is the day at which women are starting to get paid for their work, because all the days up until now have been unpaid in comparison to what a male would make. That dogma is impervious to everything that you've been talking about male and female interests, because once you adjust for the fact that they take time off to have babies, once you adjust for the types of jobs that they like to do, then the gap goes from 70 cents up to 92 cents. Or
it becomes smaller, yeah.
But why does it persist then?
I don't know. Why do we struggle to reason about so many things? I'm not sure, because there's a cultish aspect to society which resists discussion of certain difficult topics. I don't know. It's like, what do we do about the universities? There was some, I don't know, again, podcast, was it Unheard or something? And Peter Boghossian says, we just burn them down.
Oh yeah, he's an absolutist.
Yeah, just burn them down.
He's
Kathleen
over it.
Stock's a bit softer. But I mean, yeah, I don't know why these things persist. I mean, what's, and again, in the book, it's like maybe we're in the phase of overcorrection, which is, I think, a reasonable argument, where a lot, so much of the low-hanging fruit of sort of the civil rights era was plucked, and rightly so, equal pay for equal work, trying to do away with racism, all that sort of thing. And so a huge amount of these movements which needed to exist and did very good things in our liberal society, what does Pinker say? Is it Pinker? I don't know. But anyway, they don't go out of business.
Yeah, the activist groups need new demons
finding
to
new
fight.
stuff.
Yeah.
And so then you start kind of seeing phantoms, or stuff which is, it's like, yeah, there is an inequality there, but the cause of it is not entirely obvious. and yet, rather than saying it's not entirely obvious, they go, it is obvious. And so it's about just overplaying certain things, overcorrecting. And so then, that's my sense. We're in an era of overcorrection. I mean, it's quite a familiar idea.
I think it was Bill Maher who says that there's a problem, that racism has a supply and demand problem. That, there aren't enough racists for the anti-racists to be happy about the fight that they're fighting.
I think that's true.
There are more people. There are too many people angry about racism than there are racists to satisfy their demand. So they keep inventing new definitions of what racism is in order to create a greater supply of racists than actually exists.
Yeah, I know. That's yeah. I think that's definitely the case. It's an overcorrection.
Yeah.
And look, I mean, it's when that horrible Bondi stuff went down, last week.
The stabbings.
Yeah, the stabbings, and I mean, I really avoid social media, even though I've just got my Twitter account up and running, seeing as I'm on a podcast. And started a Substack.
Oh God, welcome.
I don't know. I got to try to make the move somehow. But yeah, what the hell was I saying? Yeah, I had a brief glimpse, look at Twitter, which I so don't do.
Yeah.
And it was just filled with, this is why the country shouldn't let in Muslims. And I'm like, what?
Oh, you're on the wrong Twitter. My Twitter was all about, this is why women can't feel safe, because the stabber attacked 5 women and only one.
Okay. But okay, so the Muslim thing's stupid, and so I'm looking and thinking, okay, yeah, there's that kind of racist problem in Australia is clearly still present. So it's not there. Wow, women feeling safe, yeah, yeah,
and then
that's an issue. Yeah, that's legit. As I said, I started out my life. I started out my life as a pretty radical feminist.
Let me just push back on that. Women feeling safe or not feeling safe, I'm sorry, it has nothing to do with whether or not a maniac stabs.
Sorry, I missed your angle. I was trying to work with you.
It was being interpreted. Being interpreted on my Twitter circles as being evidence of the daily reality that women have to face that men will never understand. I'm sorry, it's not a daily reality that you walk through a shopping center getting stabbed by somebody.
Yeah, it's a once in 20-year occurrence.
Right, and even then it happens for 5 people, and it's an absolute tragedy, not for the remaining.
I get your angle now.
15 million women in Australia. Nonetheless, so when you say that these things are taboo, like you talk about these things, you've written a book about these things, you analyze these things, you lecture about these things. I try to bring them up. So do you get punished for that?
It's also complex because the whole punishment scheme within the university is so distributed, and it's not centralized. It's more that I know that the more I move into certain areas, and as I say, I believe we have all of us, I think, have a very precise and clear understanding of the taboos in our society. So the more I'll move into a particular space, the more I know I'm increasing the probability that something will happen. And maybe even the majority of classes, it's fine. And the majority of students want to talk or discuss, or at least maybe they don't want to talk either because they know it's a taboo, but they kind of get that we should bring these things up. But then at other times, you get a small cabal of students who decide that you're the devil and get some abusive messages and whatnot.
But can they do anything in terms of formal sanction?
See, this is what's so interesting too. I mean, get back to the snowflake point, right? Probably not really, because hopefully even now I feel like I'm picking through my words reasonably carefully.
Do you have tenure?
Yes. So there's not a lot can happen, but what happens is your units then get a bad rating.
Right.
And then if your units get a bad rating, then people upstairs start asking questions. And then the people who are not always, but sometimes then assigned to, investigate your units are often the very people who are the greatest, I don't know, there's no other way to say it, bullies in the university, because they're often the ones in the position of power. And so, there are sort of nice woke people. And then there are the people who really do use it as career advancement or for cruelty. And so then, you then have to interact with more of a certain class of people, and the whole thing becomes extremely unpleasant because you then have to explain to the person who is a huge fan of intersectionality how the students don't like you because you were trying to point out the political or philosophical flaws in the concept of intersectionality. So you end up in these sort of investigations.
I mean, it sounds McCarthyite or Stalinist. It sounds like,
it is.
You're trying to argue for freedom of thought and expression against, without offending the ideologue who presides over your fate.
Yeah, but the thing is that even then, I don't really, I'm not going to get fired or anything. It's just a really unpleasant environment to have to work in. And some people, because I've been going through like whole, with the book troubles, and then uni troubles has been quite a bit in the last several months. And and I talk to some people. I say, there's very, very. I mean, I'm not even a conservative. I mean, I shouldn't even have to say that, but there are pretty much no conservatives where I work, maybe one or two. And I sort of, one of them I was speaking to, I'm like, how do you deal with this? Like, how do you cope with it? And he said some very interesting things. He says, they know they can't fire you, so they bully you and hope you leave. He says, I've, disengaged from it all, and I just kind of do my work, and, my psychological, my philosophical, whatever existence is elsewhere. But it's just basically, it just becomes it's just a difficult environment to work in. And like, I'm a personable person. Like, I'm into all of this stuff, I think, because I like people, I care about people. But so when you're, when you just keep getting grief at work, it's just a difficult work environment. After a while, you're just like, oh my God, seriously, fuck this shit. Work is not meant to be this, you're constantly waiting for the next email, the next battle, looking over your shoulder, it just grinds you down eventually.
So you decided that the solution was to write an entire book about Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson.
And completely.
You dumb. What did you do that for?
I don't know what's going on. Like, it just makes me angry. Like, I feel like, I think.
Was the book a fuck you?
Yeah, a bit, yeah, totally. But I've been fighting this shit since 2002. Like, I can go through all the years and just go, oh, that was the year I battled that academic and got, it didn't go well. Or that was the year I battled that academic and it didn't go well. Or that was, like, there's just, or it's just an endless stream of battling wacky postmodern ideology, identity politics, bad scholarship, theoretical frameworks, bullshit methods, and it just goes,
But you can still say all this. I mean, like, is this podcast going to get you in trouble?
Yeah, it may. I don't know. I'm doing it anyway. I don't know. But yeah, why would I say it all? My girlfriend reckoned that maybe I have a sort of autistic commitment to truth or something. But then I've
had that said of me.
But then maybe what I mean, am I just like an arrogant person for thinking like I'm the special truth-seeking guy? You know what I mean? Like, it's
no. I mean, I think that could be said of people who seek truth at all times and places. I mean, I'm sure people, in the 1950s in the United States and under Mao or whatever, the ones who dissented were regarded as being, I mean, had you superimposed the psychological mental health model on those people, you could have said that they were all Asperger's-y truth-seeking crazies as well.
But doesn't the other, this is one of my questions always, wouldn't the other side say they're the truth-seekers as well?
No, I don't think they would.
This is the big question. I mean, maybe not because they're postmodernists, but maybe.
Well, I don't think you can honestly say you're a truth seeker if all of your conclusions about everything align perfectly with the party line.
But anyway, that's the thing. part of me is just like does not deal well with conflict at all. I mean, I'll be honest, why lie? Like, it doesn't deal well with it. And the other part of me is like, if not me, then who? You know? You know,
so you're a snowflake on horseback riding into battle.
It's a really, really annoying combination. It really is, because it's like, no, must keep fighting, and then like, oh, must
hate the fight,
want to run away. What were you saying on Chris Williamson? Like the 5 stages of, I can't remember what you were saying at the start, but like one of them was go hammer fence posts.
Yeah, that's right. I think Chris was saying that. I think I was on Chris Williamson's Modern Wisdom show on YouTube and podcast. All good, where all good podcasts can be found. That's right. He was talking about the stages of a social media shitstorm, basically.
Yeah, so some stupid thing happens,
and then there's a reaction to it.
And what's his name? Matt. Anyway, this Daily Wire guy with the beard.
Oh, Matt Walsh.
Yeah. Then Matt Walsh gets onto it, and then there's a reaction. But anyway, the final stage is like you give up and you go hammer fence posts.
Yeah, which is a great alternative.
I'm genuinely working on that.
Well, you ran for 10 kilometers. That's pretty good. That's your 10th post, your green tea and your 10-kilometer run. So lastly, the book. The book is being held up from publication.
No, it got published.
But what's happened to it now?
It got published. It was out for about 2 weeks. And then I got a message saying it was suspended from sales pending an investigation.
Into?
The book.
Why?
They didn't tell me why. But I'll probably find out next week. It's all coming to the pointy end now, but they're not going to republish it unless they make changes. And so we'll have to see what's going on with all of that. But yeah, I mean, my publisher is an academic publisher, and I'm surprised I got as far as I did with an academic publisher.
But why are you surprised if they signed off on the book and had you write it in the first place? They knew what it was about.
Yeah, but look, not everyone in an institution, in an organization is the same. Some are a little bit more open-minded and I think committed to the right causes. And so, I think perhaps my original editor was, he was a good guy. And he was
Is he still there?
Maybe somewhere else. He's moved on a bit, but yeah, so maybe he recognized that it was writing about the intellectual dark web's important, seeing as these people have tens of millions of followers and it's a major cultural moment. And so to record it and try to give an overview of it with a bit of analysis is actually an important, scholarly task. But then, other people in the organization probably have a look at it and just think, there's way too many taboo discussions in here.
Yeah.
So.
And there's probably a specific, if I was a betting man, I'd bet there's a specific thing.
I think of certain things
transgender stuff.
Probably trans, yeah. I think of certain things I wrote which perhaps I could, moderate them a little.
But you're writing about other people saying these things.
I do throw in my own 2 cents occasionally.
But that's because it's, you don't want it to be unreadable. It's not a screed. It's not a tirade.
No, I try to be considered.
Not good enough anymore.
We'll see what happens. Yeah, this has got a way to run yet.
All right, fascinating. Do you think the IDW has a way to run? Like, where do you see the whole independent, heterodox, media sphere
I feel like
ending up?
Yeah, it's interesting whether it's... I ponder it all the time. I mean, my sense early last year was it was as strong as ever in many ways, even though a bunch of people have maybe lost their step. I still have a fair amount of hope for things like YouTube. Here we are. It's pretty good. I'm speaking my mind here. I feel a touch nervous, but not nearly as scared as I do in the university. So it's a great, I think it's a great place where free speech does actually kick on and difficult issues can be explored. I think so. I think that will happen unless, I don't know, it's just a question of how many people get captured. And because I didn't really, like, early on, it was far from clear that the IDW was politically aligned. Like, there's a bunch of people who are sort of left or center left, the Weinsteins, Rogan, Sam Harris, there's other people which were right, center right, Peterson, Shapiro. And now the IDW ideas have kind of just spun off to the right. The right's kind of got hold of them. And so maybe now that it's all
well, not in the case of Sam Harris or Weinstein, I wouldn't say.
But even still, the whole anti-woke thing, the right is so onto it now, and they would have got a lot of those ideas from IDW types and podcasts. So, you know, the anti-postmodernism type stuff, the anti-woke stuff. You know, a lot of the trans discussions that the right now take up were first raised like on Rogan's podcast. So, yeah, in some ways, I wonder whether it's just become an aspect of the right now. But I don't even know if that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, isn't there some argument? I mean, wasn't Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and you know, there was a sort of a reversal sometime 30s, 40s when the Republicans and the Democrats kind of flipped in the United States. And so it is actually possible for left and right.
It was LBJ really signing civil rights. In the 60s.
I can sometimes talk more authoritatively on it, but I haven't been reading up on it lately, so I hesitate. All I want to say is that it's possible that left and right do flip a little. It's possible that, maybe we're in that phase.
I would be worried if all of the heterodox, independent media content got co-opted by the right. I mean, I think you're talking about a phenomenon that is happening and has happened to some of the figures. But I think I'm deeply worried about audience capture and about the monotony of the same, concerns being
and we're sort of doing that now, aren't we?
Again. Well, you're a guest who's just written a book about it.
Okay, so that's right.
We're allowed to do it here.
All right.
I wouldn't want it to become
a monotony to it.
I wouldn't want it to become, a majority of my content.
Yeah, sure.
And if it were, I would want to be exploring it in ways that are unusual and interested and nuanced and steel manning my opponents rather than just banging on a la Matt Walsh or the Daily Wire about the threat that transgender activists pose to our children. That's boring.
It goes on.
Anyway, watch this space. Good luck with the book. I hope it turns out okay, and I hope you don't cop too much flack. Thanks for talking to us, Jamie.
Thanks, no worries, man.